What if the love of your dreams became the worst of your nightmares? Sophie traveled to a distant country to celebrate her cousin's wedding, but ended up finding something she never expected, an intense and overwhelming love. Omar was everything she had ever wanted, and in a matter of days, they were married. A fairy tale, right? Wrong. The day after the wedding, a brutal accident took Omar's life, leaving Sophie devastated. But when the police began to investigate, a dark truth came to light. It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to put an end to their happiness. And worse, Sophie knew this person. Now she has to face her past, hunt for answers, and fight for justice. But is she prepared to discover how far obsession can go? This is the true story of a love interrupted by danger, and what Sophie discovers could change everything. "You're going to love this place, Sophie," said Julia, pulling her through the gleaming airport. "It's unlike anything we've ever seen." The desert heat enveloped her as soon as they passed through the automatic doors, the dry wind whipping her skin. Sophie adjusted her sunglasses and surveyed the surrounding landscape. Stately glass buildings reflected the golden light of the setting sun, and luxurious cars glided silently through the wide streets. It was a world away from her simple life in the United States, and a part of her wondered if she belonged there. "If I'd known it would be like this, I'd have brought fewer coats," she joked, adjusting the strap of her suitcase on her shoulder. Julia laughed and hailed a cab, which took them directly to the hotel where the groom's family was staying. The place was a veritable modern palace, with glittering fountains and chandeliers that looked like they were made of crystallized stars. As soon as she entered the room, Sophie let out a deep sigh. The exhausting journey was finally coming to an end, but something inside her told her that her adventure had only just begun. The wedding reception was more extravagant than she had imagined. Under a marquee embroidered with gold thread, lights flickered over tables, decorated with exotic flowers and crystal goblets. Sophie wandered around the room, feeling a little out of place among the impeccably dressed guests. She took a glass of wine from a tray and turned to appreciate the surroundings, and it was at that moment that her arm bumped into something solid. The red liquid splashed across the dark suit of a tall, imposing man. Sophie widened her eyes, mortified. "God, I'm sorry. I'm a disaster." The man lowered his gaze to the stain and, to her surprise, let out a low laugh. "Welcome," he said, his dark eyes twinkling with amusement. "I'm Omar." Sophie swallowed. He was, without a doubt, the most attractive man she had ever seen. Tall, with an elegant posture and a smile that radiated confidence, Omar exuded a magnetism that was impossible to ignore. "Sophie," she replied, trying not to sound nervous. "So, Sophie." Omar crossed his arms, pretending to analyze the damage to his clothes. "Do you always greet people like this?" She laughed, relaxing a little. "Only the ones I'm interested in." Omar arched an eyebrow, intrigued, and Sophie cursed herself for her sudden boldness. However, instead of backing away, he moved slightly closer. "So maybe I was lucky." The electricity between them was palpable. "How do you know Julia?" Sophie asked, changing the subject to distract herself from that overwhelming feeling. "She's practically my sister now," Omar pointed to the groom, who was in the center of the dance floor. "My cousin, Amir, getting married today." "It looks like a movie wedding," commented Sophie, looking around. "Here, we like to celebrate in style." Omar smiled. "And you? Are you just here for the party?" Sophie hesitated. It was strange to think that a few weeks ago she had barely known this country, and now she was there, immersed in a culture so different from her own. "I came for Julia, of course," she said, choosing her words carefully, "but also to see something new. I needed that." Omar tilted his head, as if he understood what she wasn't saying. "Then I hope this place shows you what you're looking for." They continued talking for hours. The music, the lights, and the buzz around them seemed secondary. Sophie felt like she was being pulled into a new world, where every word exchanged with Omar was an invitation to explore something bigger. As the reception began to empty, Julia appeared beside her, smiling conspiratorially. "I saw you too," she whispered. "Don't start, Julia." Sophie rolled her eyes, but couldn't contain her smile. "I'm just saying, I've never seen you like this." As she said goodbye to Omar, Sophie realized that Julia was right. Something had changed, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. Sophie stared at the phone on the hotel bed. The display lit up with the name she had been trying to avoid. Daniel. She let out a sigh and reluctantly answered. "Finally." His voice sounded impatient. "I thought you'd forgotten that you still have a boyfriend." Sophie forced herself to stay calm. "Hi, Daniel. The time zone is complicated, and I've been busy with Julia's wedding." "Oh, right. The wedding." His tone was laced with sarcasm. "And when are you coming back? Have you had your millionaire tour yet?" Sophie bit her lip, annoyance growing inside her. Daniel always talked like that, as if his dreams and experiences were childish whims. "In a few days," he lied. The truth was that she wasn't sure. Since meeting Omar, everything seemed to have changed color. "Good. I hope you don't get too used to this life," he said before abruptly hanging up. Sophie threw the phone on the mattress, feeling a knot forming in her chest. Omar took her out for dinner on the edge of the desert the following evening. Under a star-studded sky, a rug spread out on the sand served as a makeshift table, surrounded by colorful cushions. Sophie had never experienced anything so magical. "Time moves differently here. Do you feel it?" Omar asked, looking at the dunes that stretched to the horizon. Sophie nodded, enchanted by the tranquility around her. "It's like the world has slowed down," she said. Omar smiled, picking up a small silver jug and pouring tea for them both. "When I was a child, my grandfather used to bring me here and tell me that the desert held secrets. That if you listen carefully, it tells stories on the wind." Sophie laughed, bringing the cup to her lips. "And what did he tell you?" Omar looked at her sideways. "That sometimes life gives us unexpected choices, but only the brave accept them." His words echoed inside her. She had never felt so alive as she had in the last few days, and part of that was because she was by his side. But it was crazy, wasn't it? They barely knew each other. "Do you believe that?" Sophie asked. "Yes." "Do you?" She hesitated. If she was honest with herself, she had to admit that this trip was already changing something inside her. "I'm starting to believe it." The conversation went on into the night, flowing so naturally that Sophie hardly noticed the time passing. The way Omar talked about his culture, his family, and his dreams enveloped her in a way she had never experienced before. "Tell me about yourself," he asked. Sophie stared at the sand beneath her feet. "There's not much to tell. I'm a designer who always wanted to see the world, but I've never had the courage to really throw myself into it. Until now." She smiled. "Until now." When they got back to the city, it was already dawn. Omar walked her to the hotel door and hesitated before saying goodbye. "Is someone waiting for you at home?" The question took her by surprise. "Yes, but I don't know if I'm still waiting for him." Omar kept his eyes on her for a few seconds before saying, "Then maybe it's time to choose." Sophie slept very little that night. The next morning, Julia appeared in Sophie's room with a cup of coffee and an inquisitive look on her face. "So, you and Omar, huh?" Sophie sighed, picking up the cup. "I don't know, it's happening too fast." Julia arched an eyebrow. "But do you want it to happen?" Sophie was silent for a moment before answering, "Yes." Julia smiled. "So what's holding you back?" The answer was there, clear as day. Daniel. Her life in the United States. But for the first time, Sophie wasn't sure she wanted to go back. Sophie had never felt as alive as she did that night. Under the golden lights of the decorated hall, her dress flowed as she walked towards Omar. The wedding was a spectacle of beauty and tradition, where East and West met perfectly. Omar reached out and entwined his fingers in hers. "Do you promise that we will always find our way back to each other?" he asked, softly, so that only she could hear. Sophie smiled, her heart beating fast. "Always." The officiant began the ceremony in Arabic, while a translator whispered the words in her ear. Despite the language barrier, Sophie understood the meaning. This was not just a union between two people, but between different worlds. When Omar put the ring on her finger, Sophie felt a shiver run through her body. Everything felt like a dream. The warmth of his gaze, the murmur of the guests, the glow of the candles around them. "You're my wife now," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. The reception was filled with music, dancing, and laughter. Julia kept casting excited glances at Sophie. "I've never seen you so happy," she said, taking her cousin's hand. "Because I never was," Sophie admitted. The guests toasted the couple, and Omar pulled her up to dance. The world around them disappeared as they moved together as one. That night, as they lay under the starry sky in their bridal suite, Omar played with Sophie's fingers. "What if we have 3 children?" she asked, smiling. "3." Omar laughed. "I was thinking of 5. Sophie laughed. "You want a soccer team?" He pulled her closer. "I want a life with you, Sophie. That's all that matters." At that moment, Sophie felt she had made the right choice. The next day dawned with a perfect blue sky. Sophie looked out over the hotel balcony and smiled. The future looked promising. Omar came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Are you ready for our new life?" "More than ever." They went down to the car that would take them to the airport. Their honeymoon awaited them, a paradise destination chosen by Omar. "I've never been happier," Sophie said, holding his hand. He turned to her and smiled. That's when it all happened. A blinding headlight appeared in the rearview mirror, too fast for them to react. The impact came like thunder. The car spun around, its side crashing into a guardrail. Sophie heard glass shattering, felt the world spin, her body being thrown against the seatbelt. The metallic sound of twisting iron filled her ears before everything became a blur. For a moment there was silence, then a scream. "Omar!" But he didn't answer. The strong smell of gasoline and twisted metal was the first thing that hit Sophie when she opened her eyes. Pain pulsed through her head, and her body was trapped under the seatbelt. The world around her seemed distorted, fragmented. Broken glass covered her lap, and an insistent ringing echoed in her ears. "Omar!" His voice came out weak, hoarse. Silence. With a painful effort, Sophie turned her head. The seat next to her was still. Omar lay there, his head tilted to the side, his face smeared with blood. "Omar!" she screamed, her voice laced with despair. Her hands pulled open the car door, and voices in a language she could barely process sounded all around her. Someone unbuckled her and pulled her out of the vehicle. The sunlight blinded her as she lay on the hot asphalt floor. People were talking around her, but everything seemed distant, like a bad dream. "He needs help!" she tried to shout, but it all came out as a shaky whisper. The paramedics worked quickly, but the look on one of their faces, filled with grief, made Sophie's heart drop. Omar wasn't moving. The ambulance took them to the hospital, where the cold, white corridors made her feel even more out of place. Julia appeared at some point, her face pale with shock. "Sophie!" She knelt beside the stretcher, holding her hand. "Is he all right?" Sophie begged, feeling her throat tighten. Julia's silence destroyed her. "No, no." Sophie shook her head frantically. Julia hugged her tightly, and it was there that Sophie collapsed. The next few days were a blur. Sophie refused to accept that Omar was gone. Her mind relived every moment together, as if she could bring him back. The funeral was painful. Dressed in black, Sophie watched the last traces of the man she loved disappear beneath the sand. "He loved you," said Amir, Omar's cousin, his voice breaking. "You brought him happiness." She tried to reply, but the words wouldn't come out. After the funeral, Sophie locked herself in her hotel room, refusing to speak to anyone, until a soft knock interrupted her mourning. It was a detective. "Miss Sophie, I'm sorry to disturb you at this difficult time, but we need to talk about the accident." Accident. The word sounded wrong in her mouth. The detective exchanged glances with another policeman before continuing. "We've discovered something worrying." Sophie's heart raced. "What do you mean?" He pulled out a tablet and showed an image captured by a security camera, a dark car following theirs, moments before the crash. Sophie froze. "That car!" Her voice shook. She knew that model. A chill went through her body. She knew the owner of that car. A chill ran down Sophie's spine as she stared at the tablet screen. The car in the image was all too familiar. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the words were barely coming out. "That's Daniel's car." The detective frowned. "Are you sure?" Sophie swallowed. "I dated Daniel for years. I know that car. I know it's his." The images showed the vehicle following Omar's car on the day of the accident, accelerating just before the collision. Sophie's stomach churned. "But he's in the United States," she said, almost to herself. The detective exchanged a quick glance with his colleague before replying, "No. Her ex-boyfriend arrived in the country 3 days before the wedding." Sophie felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The investigation progressed quickly. The detective discovered that Daniel had used a false name when staying in a discreet hotel in the city. He avoided credit card transactions and was only identified by security cameras around the ceremony. Julia held Sophie's hand as they listened to the findings. "He came after you," murmured Julia, horrified. Sophie felt nauseous. How could Daniel have done something like that? The detective pressed his lips together before continuing. "We also intercepted a phone call. It was made the day before the accident." He picked up a handset and pressed a button on the tablet. Daniel's voice sounded, distorted by the noise of the call. "Are you sure it's going to be today?" "Yes. They're going out together." Sophie's blood ran cold. "He planned—" The sentence died before it was completed. The detective turned off the recording. "We have enough evidence for an arrest warrant." Julia squeezed Sophie's shoulder. "He needs to pay for this." Sophie felt a lump in her throat, but nodded. 2 days later, Daniel was found trying to flee the country. When the news arrived, Sophie couldn't tell what she was feeling. Anger, relief, fear. Everything seemed to be mixed together. On the day of his arrest, she was called in to identify him. When she entered the interrogation room, he looked up and smiled. "Sophie," he said, as if they were meeting casually. She swallowed her fear and kept her voice steady. "Why?" Daniel tilted his head, his eyes cold. "If I couldn't have you—" "No one could." Sophie's stomach churned. "You killed Omar." He smiled sideways. "I just made sure he got out of the way." Sophie felt bile rise in her throat. "You'll rot for that." She turned and left without looking back. The courtroom was packed. Television cameras, journalists and onlookers filled the space, following the trial that had made the headlines. The case of the young widow and her obsessed ex-boyfriend was already known throughout the country. Sophie sat in the row reserved for the prosecution. Julia held her hand, squeezing it tightly. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up. Daniel was handcuffed. He looked different from the man Sophie had known. Thin, haggard, but his eyes still carried that familiar darkness. The prosecution presented all the evidence. The images of the car following Omar, the records of Daniel's stay, the intercepted phone call. As the recording echoed through the room, Sophie closed her eyes. "Are you sure it's going to be today?" "Yes. They're going out together." Sophie felt a shiver run through her body. It was still hard to believe that he had been capable of so much. Then it was her turn to testify. She walked over to the witness stand. and took a deep breath. "Miss Sophie, can you tell us about your relationship with the defendant?" She stared at Daniel for a moment before answering. "At first, he was kind, but over time, I began to realize that everything revolved around him. My dreams, my wishes, nothing mattered. When I decided to travel, he made me feel guilty for wanting something more than what we had." "And when did you meet Omar?" Sophie hesitated. "Omar showed me what it was like to be truly loved. I finally understood that what I had with Daniel wasn't love, it was control." The defense lawyer tried to argue insanity, but it was useless. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge banged his gavel. "Guilty." The air in the room seemed to lighten. Sophie closed her eyes, allowing herself to breathe deeply for the first time in weeks. Daniel was taken away, but before he left, he gave her one last look. "It's not over yet," he muttered. But for Sophie, it was. A few days later, she said goodbye to Julia at the airport. "Are you sure you don't want to stay a while longer?" Sophie smiled sadly. "This place will always be special to me, but I need a fresh start." Julia hugged her tightly. "Omar would have been proud of you." Sophie held back tears. "I hope so." In Spain, Sophie found a new home by the sea. The sound of the waves brought her a peace she hadn't felt for a long time. She opened a small art gallery, inspired by the colors and culture she had experienced alongside Omar. His name was engraved on the wall as a reminder that he would always be a part of her. One quiet afternoon, sitting on the balcony, she looked out to sea and whispered, "Omar, I will never forget you." The wind blew gently as if in answer, and Sophie finally allowed herself to move on.